House chamber buzzed with quiet tension as Representative Jasmine Crockett stepped toward the podium. C-SPAN cameras zoomed in on the freshman Democrat from Texas. Her braided hair neatly pulled back, dressed in a striking purple suit that stood out amid the dark blues and grays on the House floor. Across the room, Speaker Mike Johnson sat stiffly in his chair, scrolling through his phone, seemingly unconcerned about the 5 minutes of speaking time allotted to the outspoken Congresswoman. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett began, her voice calm yet commanding. The chamber fell silent as her tone demanded attention. "Today, I rise not as a Democrat addressing a Republican, but as an American speaking about a serious breach of public trust." Johnson glanced up briefly, his expression composed, showing the polite detachment of someone accustomed to routine criticism. Another opposition speech, he thought, and nodded slightly before returning to his phone. Crockett's voice grew stronger. "Last week, you stood at this very podium and told the American people that the new border bill was created with, quote, full transparency and unprecedented bipartisan cooperation. I have in my possession documents that not only contradict that claim, but also reveal a troubling pattern of intentional misinformation presented to members of this body." This time, Johnson looked up completely, his brow tightening. A few nearby representatives paused their conversations. Turning toward Crockett, "These documents," she said, holding up a folder bearing the House seal, "prove that the final version of the bill was secretly changed after committee approval. Key enforcement measures were removed, and new loopholes added, without informing the minority members who had negotiated in good faith." The quiet background chatter in the chamber grew louder. Johnson placed his phone on the desk, sitting upright as Republican whips moved through the aisles, whispering to colleagues. "But what's even more concerning," Crockett continued, her voice cutting through the growing noise, "is who actually wrote these changes." She paused, locking eyes with Johnson across the chamber. "Mr. Speaker, would you care to explain why entire passages from private industry lobbyists appear in sections of this bill that you personally certified were drafted by your staff?" A stunned silence filled the room. Johnson's face lost color as he leaned toward the parliamentarian. Cameras shifted between Crockett's composed expression and Johnson's visible unease. "Point of order, Mr. Speaker," called out the Republican Majority Leader, trying to interrupt. "I still have 4 minutes and 20 seconds remaining," Crockett said steadily, "and I plan to use them." What unfolded in the next few minutes would send ripples through Congress and shift the political balance in Washington. Before we continue with what Crockett revealed next, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more in-depth political coverage exposing what really happens behind the scenes in Washington. Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to Congress to follow tradition. A civil rights attorney before winning her Texas seat in 2022, she built her reputation on careful preparation and fearless accountability. While many new representatives spent their early terms learning the system, Crockett quickly established herself as someone who did her homework and wasn't afraid to use it. She approaches Congress like she approached the courtroom, her former law partner said in a Texas Tribune profile earlier that year. She gathers evidence, builds a solid case, and delivers it without hesitation, no matter who's on the other side. This method earned her respect among progressives, but also made her a frequent target for conservative outlets, who described her as combative and overly aggressive. Her viral response to that criticism during a CNN interview made her position clear. "When men are firm and direct, they're called effective. When I do the same, I'm called aggressive. I'll keep being aggressive for the people who elected me." Across the chamber sat Speaker Mike Johnson, who rose to leadership after Kevin McCarthy's removal through a turbulent process. The Louisiana Republican had presented himself as a steady, faith-driven conservative capable of uniting a divided GOP. His calm demeanor and reputation for personal integrity initially earned him praise from both lawmakers and media alike. Johnson represents a return to civility. Fox News host Sean Hannity had said after his election, "He's a constitutionalist who values transparency and honest debate." But 7 months into his tenure, that goodwill was fading. Moderate Republicans complained of being sidelined, while Democrats accused him of breaking promises made during key negotiations. The border security bill at the heart of this confrontation had been promoted by Johnson as his signature bipartisan achievement. After months of gridlock, it passed with support from moderate Democrats and nearly all Republicans. Johnson spent the following week on a media tour celebrating it as proof that Congress could still cooperate to address national challenges. What the public didn't yet know was that serious concerns had emerged about how the final text was crafted and whether commitments made during negotiations had been upheld. The stakes of this exchange went well beyond one piece of legislation. With midterm elections approaching and control of Congress uncertain, questions about honesty and leadership could reshape the political landscape. For Republicans, any sign that their speaker had misled colleagues threatened their message of government reform and transparency. This isn't just a policy dispute, political scientist Melissa Harris Perry said on MSNBC earlier that morning, unaware of what was about to unfold. The real question is whether our legislative process has become so compromised that even bipartisan agreements can't be trusted. For Johnson, the personal stakes were immense. He had built his image as a man of integrity, someone who could restore faith in congressional leadership. Any confirmed evidence of deception could destroy not just his political agenda, but his credibility as a leader. For Crockett, the gamble was equally high. Directly challenging the Speaker on the House floor was a bold move that could either define her as a fearless advocate for accountability or expose her to accusations of grandstanding if her evidence failed to deliver. As the minutes passed, the tension in the chamber mirrored those risks. Republican members clustered protectively around Johnson, occasionally whispering advice, while Democrats sat silently, waiting for what would come next. Members watched closely, fully aware that Representative Crockett's presentation would reflect on the integrity of her entire party. As she prepared to present her evidence, the historical weight of the moment was evident. A freshman congresswoman was directly confronting the Speaker, accusing him of misleading actions in the legislative process. This confrontation could either fade into insignificance or become a defining moment for political accountability. Johnson adjusted his tie and leaned toward the parliamentarian, seemingly looking for procedural grounds to interrupt Crockett's remaining time. But before he could act, she continued her careful presentation. Before we review the altered text of the bill, Crockett began, let's establish the context that makes these revisions so concerning. She called the chamber's attention to Exhibit A, as aides distributed documents to members. These are the official minutes from the final bipartisan negotiation on the Border Security Act, dated exactly 2 weeks ago. A section appeared on the chamber's main screen. Page 3 clearly shows Speaker Johnson's personal commitment, and I quote, "No substantial changes will be made to the enforcement provisions in sections 4 through 7 as agreed upon by this working group." Every member of that group, Republican and Democrat alike, relied on that assurance when supporting the bill. C-SPAN cameras captured the scene as Republican members quickly reviewed the documents, while Johnson spoke quietly with the parliamentarian. Yet, Crockett continued, the final version of this bill contains 17 substantive alterations to those very sections. These are not simple technical edits. They are fundamental, changes that weaken enforcement mechanisms and introduce new exemptions never discussed in bipartisan meetings. She displayed a side-by-side comparison on the screen. For example, Section 4EB3 originally required compliance verification within 30 days. The final version extends that to 180 days and adds a clause allowing unlimited 90-day extensions. This completely undermines the enforcement timeline that moderate Democrats demanded as a condition of their support. Murmurs spread through the Democratic side, particularly among moderates who had voted for the bill. Several were seen questioning their staff, pointing to specific sections with visible frustration. Finally, Johnson rose. "Point of order, Mr. Speaker," he said, addressing the presiding officer. The gentlewoman from Texas is misrepresenting standard legislative refinements and assigning improper motives to routine procedural adjustments. "I appreciate the Speaker's description." Crockett replied calmly, "But let's move to Exhibit B." New documents appeared on the screen. These are emails between the Speaker's chief, legislative aide, and representatives of the Border Industry Coalition, lobbying group representing private detention. Contractors, Johnson's expression tightened as Crockett continued. This email, sent 3 days after the bipartisan agreement and 2 days before the final bill text was released, includes an attachment titled proposed modifications to enforcement provisions. When we compare this document, created by private industry lobbyists, to the final bill, we find that 15 of the 17 changes match word for word. The chamber erupted with noise. Democratic members stood in disbelief, while Republicans gathered in small, uneasy groups. The presiding officer struck the gavel repeatedly, attempting to restore order. An unexpected interruption came as Representative Jim Jordan, one of Johnson's close allies, approached the front. Crockett raised her hand. "I still have my time, and I intend to use it," she said firmly. "The evidence is not yet complete," Jordan hesitated, then returned to his seat. Crockett presented Exhibit C. "This," she said, "is perhaps the most troubling document of all. A text message exchange between Speaker Johnson and the president of the Border Industry Coalition, dated one day before the final text was released." She read aloud. "Changes implemented as discussed. Dems won't notice until after passage. We'll call you after the vote." The room fell silent. Johnson's expression turned from concern to shock. Democratic members looked stunned, while many Republicans appeared conflicted, some rallying behind their speaker, others distancing themselves in discomfort. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett said, turning directly toward him, "would you like to explain to this body, especially the Democratic members who supported this bill in good faith, why you promised no substantive changes would be made, while secretly coordinating with industry lobbyists to alter key enforcement provisions?" Johnson stood again, his composure strained. "These claims are being taken completely out of context," he said. "The communications were part of normal stakeholder outreach to ensure practical implementation. No commitments were violated in spirit or intent." "The evidence suggests otherwise," Crockett replied. She displayed a split-screen comparison showing the bipartisan agreement, the lobbyists' recommendations, and the final text. "These are not interpretations," she said. "They are direct textual matches. The enforcement mechanisms that secured bipartisan support were systematically weakened according to industry requests, without notice to those who negotiated them." The tension in the chamber reached a breaking point. The gavel struck continuously as members from both sides demanded recognition. "I have 1 minute remaining," Crockett announced, her voice cutting through the noise. "And I want to use it not just to discuss what happened, but why it matters." The room gradually quieted, all eyes fixed on the freshman representative who had just shifted the chamber's balance of power. "This isn't just about a policy disagreement," she said in a steady, deliberate tone. "It's about whether we can function as a legislative body. If members cannot trust that agreements made in good faith will be honored, the foundation of our work collapses. When private interests can when we rewrite legislation after a bipartisan agreement, we stop being true representatives of the people." Turning to face the entire chamber instead of just Johnson, Crockett continued, "I came to Congress believing that, no matter our disagreements, the integrity of our process was sacred. Today, I'm asking members of both parties to prove that still holds true." With impeccable timing, her 5 minutes expired just as she concluded her statement. The weight of her words lingered as the presiding officer, visibly shaken, announced, "The gentlewoman's time has expired." But everyone in the chamber, and millions watching at home, understood that something far more significant had ended than just her allotted time. For several seconds, silence filled the room. Then chaos erupted. Democratic members rose to their feet, some demanding an immediate response from Johnson, others calling for an emergency ethics inquiry. Republican reactions were split. Party leaders gathered protectively around Johnson, while moderate members stood apart, visibly unsettled as they reviewed the documents Crockett had shared. The presiding officer banged the gavel repeatedly. "The House will be in order! The House will be in order!" Finally, Majority Leader Steve Scalise was recognized. "Mr. Speaker, I move that the House stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair." Before the motion could proceed, Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries rose. "Objection. The House deserves an immediate response to these extraordinary allegations. The Speaker must address this chamber now." The parliamentarian leaned in to consult with the presiding officer, who appeared increasingly overwhelmed by the procedural turmoil unfolding before them. Amid the confusion, Johnson approached the well of the House, signaling that he wished to speak. Instantly, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. "I appreciate the opportunity to respond to these allegations," Johnson began, his voice steadier than his expression. "What Representative Crockett presented is a misleading narrative built on selective evidence and misrepresented communications." Straightening his posture, he tried to project confidence. The adjustments made to the final text were technical corrections, intended to uphold the spirit of our bipartisan deal while ensuring the bill's enforceability. "We consulted various stakeholders, including industry experts, for practical input. This is standard legislative procedure." Turning toward the Democrats, he continued, "Nothing was concealed, and nothing was done in bad faith. If some members misunderstood certain provisions, I regret that confusion. But there was no intent to deceive. It was a composed response that might have sufficed under normal circumstances." But Crockett, still standing at her podium, raised a document visible to Johnson and the cameras. It was the same text message she had shown earlier. "Changes implemented as discussed. Dems won't notice until after passage. We'll call you after the vote." Johnson froze mid-sentence, his explanation colliding with the undeniable evidence of his own words. The entire chamber watched as he visibly struggled to reconcile his claims of transparency with the text contradicting them. Then something remarkable occurred. Representative Don Bacon, a moderate Republican from Nebraska, rose to speak. "Mr. Speaker, point of personal privilege," he said, his voice steady but grave. "As someone who worked on this legislation in good faith, I must ask, are the documents presented by Representative Crockett authentic? Did you assure our bipartisan group that no significant changes would be made while allowing lobbyists to alter enforcement provisions?" The question, coming from within Johnson's own party, hit like a thunderclap. The chamber fell silent again, all eyes turning toward Johnson. His response would define not only his leadership, but the future credibility of the House itself. He scanned the room, from his loyal supporters to the growing number of uneasy faces on both sides of the aisle. "The communications occurred," Johnson finally admitted quietly, "but they've been taken out of context. The revisions were within my authority as Speaker." An audible gasp swept through the chamber. It wasn't a full confession, but it wasn't a denial either. Representative Bacon remained standing. "With respect, Mr. Speaker, authority isn't the issue, trust is. If we can't rely on bipartisan agreements being honored, how can this body function?" His question hung unanswered as more Republicans quietly distanced themselves from leadership. What began as a 5-minute floor speech by a freshman, Democrat had escalated into a full-blown crisis of confidence in the Speaker. Sensing the shifting atmosphere, Democratic leader Jeffries rose again. "Given these extraordinary circumstances, I move that the House establish a bipartisan special committee to investigate the allegations concerning the Border Security Act and report back within 14 days. In a stunning moment, Representative Bacon spoke next. "I second the motion and urge my Republican colleagues to support it. If we truly believe in transparency and integrity, we should welcome an investigation to establish the full facts." Johnson stood motionless at the podium, watching as his authority visibly crumbled. The presiding officer, unsure how to proceed amid this unprecedented breakdown of party unity, turned anxiously to the parliamentarian. Then, Crockett spoke once more, her tone calm but resolute. "This isn't about political gain," she said. "It's about whether agreements made across the aisle mean anything. Every member here, regardless of party, has a stake in preserving that trust." Her straightforward words struck a chord. Members on both sides nodded, recognizing that something essential to their institution had been endangered, something beyond partisanship. As leaders from both parties huddled with the parliamentarian to determine next steps, cameras captured Johnson sitting alone at the leadership desk, his isolation mirroring his collapsing political position. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were circulating online, focusing on Johnson's text and his inability to refute the evidence. What began as a routine 5-minute speech had become one of the most consequential congressional moments in years, raising not just concerns about one bill, but about the integrity of the legislative process itself. The aftermath was immediate. A Johnson exposed and Crockett receipts trended nationwide within the hour. News outlets broke into live coverage, with CNN's Jake Tapper calling it one of the most dramatic congressional confrontations in modern history. What we saw today wasn't theater, explained former House parliamentarian Charles Johnson on MSNBC. Representative Crockett presented documented evidence that the Speaker secretly altered bipartisan legislation after agreement, potentially violating House rules and the trust required for Congress to function. Outside, reporters flooded the halls seeking reactions. Responses were sharply divided along party lines, but not entirely. Democratic Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez expressed admiration. What Congresswoman Crockett did today was remarkable. She didn't just make claims, she brought proof. That's real accountability in real time. Republican reactions exposed growing divisions within the party. Johnson's allies dismissed the evidence as incomplete and taken out of context, while moderates voiced serious unease. Representative Bacon elaborated on his earlier comments to reporters, saying, "If these claims prove true, they represent a serious breach of trust in our legislative process. This isn't a partisan issue. It's about the integrity of Congress itself." By evening, the political fallout had deepened. Following an emergency Republican conference meeting, described as tense, Johnson released a written statement. "I take concerns about transparency seriously. Communication with stakeholders is a normal part of legislating, but I regret if it appeared that changes to the Border Security Act were made in secret or bad faith. I welcome a full review of the facts." The statement's careful language and lack of direct denial only invited more questions. On Fox News, even usually supportive hosts pressed GOP guests on whether Johnson had broken trust. Conservative commentator Guy Benson remarked, "Whatever your politics, when you tell members one thing and industry representatives another, it creates a serious credibility issue." Overnight polling reflected immediate damage. Johnson's approval rating fell 14 points in the first survey after the confrontation. More troubling for GOP leaders, 62% of independents and even 41% of Republicans said they found Crockett's evidence credible or concerning. Behind the scenes, political maneuvering accelerated. Democratic leaders, recognizing the issue's potential influence on midterm elections, announced they would force a vote to create a special investigative committee if Republicans didn't agree voluntarily. Meanwhile, reports surfaced of moderate Republicans quietly questioning whether Johnson could remain in his position. For Crockett, the aftermath marked a major rise in national visibility. Her careful, evidence-driven approach won praise from unexpected figures. Conservative columnist Jonah Goldberg wrote, "Regardless of your politics, Crockett showed what real congressional oversight looks like, relying on clear evidence, not vague accusations." 3 days after the confrontation, Washington was stunned when 23 moderate House Republicans joined Democrats in voting to form a bipartisan special committee to investigate the Border Security Act allegations. The motion passed 255-180, a sharp rebuke to Johnson's leadership and a validation of Crockett's method. In another blow, GOP Representatives Don Bacon, Brian Fitzpatrick, and Nancy Mace released a joint statement explaining their decision. The integrity of the legislative process must rise above party. When doubts emerge about whether bipartisan deals were respected, every member has a duty to seek the truth. The new committee included equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans, with moderate Republican Mike Turner as chair and Crockett as vice chair. Her appointment recognized her role in revealing the issue and solidified her growing influence in Congress. For Johnson, the political damage only worsened. A week after the confrontation, the Washington Examiner published new documents supporting Crockett's claims, including texts between Johnson's staff and industry representatives discussing how to sidestep enforcement provisions without alerting Democrats. Under mounting pressure, Johnson addressed his party privately. Multiple attendees said his remarks were more candid than before. "I made mistakes in handling the final bill. While I believe the changes were necessary for implementation, I should have been transparent with everyone involved." But the admission failed to calm dissent. 2 weeks after Crockett's speech, Republican Representative Ken Buck of Colorado became the first to publicly call for Johnson's resignation, stating, "Trust, once broken, is hard to restore. For the good of this institution and effective governance, Speaker Johnson should step aside." Buck's statement wasn't immediately fatal, but triggered a wave of similar calls. Within days, 5 more Republicans echoed his view, with others reportedly reconsidering their support. The special committee's investigation moved swiftly and with unusual cooperation. Unlike typical congressional probes often marred by partisanship, this one maintained focus and bipartisanship, perhaps because it originated from a breach of shared trust. After 2 weeks of collecting documents and interviewing witnesses, the committee released preliminary findings that upheld Crockett's main allegations. It concluded that Johnson had approved significant changes to enforcement provisions after bipartisan agreement, mirroring language proposed by industry lobbyists, and that efforts had been made to conceal those edits from Democratic members until after passage. The evidence is clear, the report stated. Commitments made during bipartisan negotiations were not honored. In the final legislation, the changes were inserted in a way designed to remain unnoticed until after the vote. The report, signed by all committee members, including Republicans, delivered a serious blow to Johnson's remaining authority. Within hours of its release, House Republican Whip Tom Emmer called for an emergency conference meeting to discuss new leadership options. Just 3 days later, in a move that would have seemed unimaginable only a month earlier, Mike Johnson announced he would resign as Speaker while continuing to serve in Congress. He explained, "To allow our conference and this institution to move forward without distraction, I believe it is best for me to step aside from leadership at this time." Johnson's resignation marked a remarkable validation of Representative Crockett's 5-minute confrontation. A first-term lawmaker had effectively ended the speakership of one of the highest officials in the chamber through careful and factual presentation of his actions. Beyond the immediate political fallout, the incident sparked a wider discussion about the functioning of Congress. Editorial boards across the political spectrum, from the Wall Street Journal to the Washington Post, published analyses on how the legislative process had become so distorted that such deception was even possible. As congressional scholar Norman Ornstein wrote, the Crockett-Johnson confrontation revealed a deeper institutional crisis, when bipartisan agreements can be secretly altered between negotiation and final text. He noted, the essential trust required for legislation disappears. For Crockett personally, the experience transformed her from a promising newcomer into a national figure in government. Accountability. "I didn't come to Congress seeking this fight," she said during a 60 Minutes interview a month later. "But when I discovered evidence that our legislative process had been compromised, I had a duty to act, no matter the political risk." Her method soon became a model studied by lawmakers across party lines. Dubbed the Crockett Method, it emphasized detailed investigation, documentary evidence, and framing accountability issues based on principle rather than partisanship. According to a Politico analysis, what made Crockett's presentation so impactful wasn't just the evidence itself, but how she framed it as a defense of institutional integrity rather than a partisan attack. That approach made it easier for Republicans to support an investigation without feeling disloyal to their party. 6 months later, under new House leadership and with stronger rules for finalizing bill text, the effects of those 5 minutes still echoed. Bipartisan teams introduced new verification procedures for legislative drafts, and both parties placed greater emphasis on transparency in lawmaking. As The Atlantic later summarized, sometimes in politics, 5 minutes can change everything. Crockett's confrontation with Johnson may be remembered not only for its immediate consequences, but for briefly reminding the nation that despite our divisions, democracy depends on a shared commitment to honesty and integrity in our institutions. As this story continues to influence American politics, we'll keep you updated with the latest developments and analysis. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay informed about the evolving story of congressional accountability. Following this historic moment, your support enables us to deliver in-depth coverage of how power operates in Washington, and the rare instances when courageous individuals manage to hold it accountable.